Today on Inside Utah Politics, international adoptees getting ripped from their families and deported. Why this is happening and the solution being considered by lawmakers. And the IRS is warning of possible delays as you file your taxes this year. What's behind the backlog and ways you can get around it?
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics, and we do begin this morning with Sarah Jones. She's here to discuss the Adoptee Citizenship Act. Sarah, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Glenn, for having me.
Let's first get into the problem. Define that for us, because I think a lot of people here in the state of Utah and those even viewing this program this morning may not be aware of it.
Thanks, Glenn. You know, I'm an international adoptee, so let's just say that up front. I was adopted to Utah when I was 3 years old. And even adoptees are really surprised to learn about this situation where many thousands of adoptees don't have citizenship. And when you said it, you know, opened up the segment today, that's exactly right. It separates families, and we should, in Utah, not really be supporting anything that is not family friendly. And what we do know is that years ago, in my generation, people were adopted into families from all different countries. In fact, in 2000, they changed the law in the Childhood Citizenship Act to give automatic citizenship to children who are adopted. The problem is that there was this arbitrary date put in place right then where it left out older adoptees. So older adoptees like myself, I actually fall in that age group, falls in that the older immigration rules, and it is so hard to get citizenship for those folks who didn't get the parenting or the guardianship to complete the immigration and the naturalization process.
Sarah, I should mention you and I are longtime friends. I met you in middle school, and we went to high school together and the same college and whatnot, but you hit on a key point there. You were in a family situation where you were able to make sure to go through those steps and get citizenship. It's those that maybe don't have that type of family environment that are falling victim here, correct?
Absolutely, Glenn. And you know, the sad reality is, and no one wants to really think about this, but many adoptees don't end up in families with stable situations. Sometimes their parents die. Sometimes they end up in foster care. You know, sadly, some are emotionally, physically abused, and so they are not given that situation with parenting who either knew to complete the naturalization process or had the resources to do it. Many parents just innocently thought that when they adopted their children from other countries, their children would get automatic citizenship. I mean, that just makes so much sense, especially when you're legally adopted to a U.S. citizen parent. And come to find out many decades later, I mean, I lived my entire life believing I was a U.S. citizen, feeling like I was part of my family, being treated in all respects, even religiously sealed in the LDS temple, like many children are in Utah. And then come to find out decades later that you actually aren't a U.S. citizen. It's really shocking.
And when you do find that out decades later, a lot of problems come along with that. Talk about that.
Well, you know, I'm going to say I've never had to experience the immigration system myself. My parents, I was lucky enough to have my parents complete the naturalization process when I was 14. But if you have been in that situation of being an immigrant, it is a daunting process. And so many of these folks who end up in this situation are having to navigate the immigration system, usually alone, without resources. Unfortunately, their adoptive parents who chose to bring them to the United States are either no longer able to or no longer willing to support them in this process. And so they don't get the benefit of that support system. When they're faced in that extreme situation, like you said, of deportation, oftentimes they're discovering their lack of citizenship while they're going through the criminal justice system. And you know, if you kind of boil it down to its essence, none of us would be okay with that happening to our biological child. And so why would we be okay with that happening to children who were brought over to the United States with the promise of a permanent family, permanent citizenship?
And when you are faced in that situation, obviously it impacts getting a job, housing, all sorts of things. So a big problem there. And we've actually seen some international adoptees get taken from their families and have been deported.
That's right. And, I've had a lot of people ask me, Sarah, why is this an economic issue? This is a family issue. It's a social issue. And I, have had to think about this for a very long time, because I was one of those that was really surprised that this was still happening as well. And I've been doing diversity and inclusion work for over 20 years. And when we stop to think about citizenship and what that means, it's really hit home at how much we take for granted, right? The ability to apply for a job, serve in the military, get a passport, just those things that are just that much easier for those who are just given citizenship. Those are the things we take for granted every day, that these international adoptees who don't have citizenship just struggle and cannot take for granted.
Okay, there is a solution on the table. It's being considered in
Absolutely.
Washington, D.C. It is the ADOPTEE Act of 2021. Sarah, what would that do to clear up this situation?
Well, I'm really excited that our own Utah Congressman John Curtis is the lead sponsor of the Adoptee Citizenship Act. So I think Utah should be incredibly proud about that. It does a couple of important things. It's going to retroactively grant U.S. citizenship to all international adoptees. So all of those adoptees older, like myself, who got left out of that first round in 2000, would now be included. And then it also is inclusive of anyone who were under the impacts of this law since it was enacted. I mean, Glenn, that was over 20 years ago when they changed this, and oh gosh, a lot's happened in 20 years. And people have to live their lives, right? And so there's a lot that happened. And we want to make sure that for all of those adoptees who were in that situation and brought over to this country, some of them are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, if you can believe it, that are faced without citizenship, that they're given that opportunity, and that it's inclusive of all international adoptees.
And what's the outlook for this? How's it looking?
I'm really excited to say it's incredibly bipartisan. I'm not going to take credit for the national work that's going on. A group that I volunteer with, Adoptees for Justice, is leading on the national strategy there. Currently, there's 63 House sponsors, incredibly bipartisan. Again, thank you, Congressman Curtis. Also, Congressman Owens is also a co-sponsor on the House side. The Senate, it actually started in the House, right? So as we know, that needs to build and it needs to go through committee and pass in the House. But the Senate's also building in support, and the Senate was introduced by Blunt as a very bipartisan effort on the Senate side as well.
Okay. Also, the Utah legislature sending a message through a concurrent resolution. Tell us about that.
That's what's so exciting about this. We as Utahns can show our support and show our encouragement to really cure this issue for adopted individuals. Senator Iwamoto has been incredibly supportive of this issue and doing everything in her power to make it happen. I'm really pleased that since the legislature opened just 9 days ago, there's already 9 Senate co-sponsors, which is really, really exciting. There's been a lot of work by a Utah group of leaders led by Scott Anderson and Shelley Johnson at Zions Bank, and just so many leaders and experts and legal experts that are supporting this effort at the Utah level.
And you mentioned the bipartisan nature at the national level. We're seeing that here in the state as well. Again, this is a statement or a message that the Utah legislature is looking to send in support of this act. But Senator Jake Andrig, a Republican, also one of the key co-sponsors in the Senate.
Absolutely, and this is why it doesn't have to be a political issue. It's about families. The Utah way has always been very family friendly, child friendly, refugee friendly, right? We're very welcoming and inclusive here in Utah. Decades ago, we were welcoming to all of these international adoptees. And so now we have a chance to just remind people that we want to make sure that they're not going to be treated differently than biological children. It is a way that many Utah families form their families and have children. And so we want to make sure that Utah is one of those leading in the nation to be able to say we care about this, we care about the people in America. We want America to be leading when it comes to adoption law. And
Sarah, you've already mentioned you are an international adoptee yourself. You're very passionate about this, even though you don't fall into that situation. You were able to go through the citizenship process, but still, you're very passionate about this. You reached out to me months ago saying, you got to get me on your show to talk about this during the session, and here we are. So why is it that you take such a role in making sure this happens?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about what would it be like to have to go back and live in the country where you came from, your country of origin. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? The rise in Asian violence And I also reconnected with my birth family about 3 years ago. You know, Glenn, it's been interesting going through that experience because there's so many barriers to me connecting to my birth family. Language, culture, customs are different. You know, every way of life is so different. And I grew up as American. And I think when people say, well, you know, what's the big deal about somebody having to go live back in a different country without connections, without cultural connection, cultural knowledge, think about that disconnection they're going to have. You know, the sad reality is some adoptees who are sent back to their country end up dying by suicide. It is that big of a struggle for them to reconnect, and it's just not just. Right, so that if that happens, that should be their choice to go, but not be forced or kicked out of the country.
All right. Sarah, thanks so much. We'll be watching to see how this resolution plays out, and we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Glenn.
Still to come on Inside Utah Politics, Utah's population boom. A new study projecting it's only just begun. How many more people are expected to call Utah home by 2060? But first, lawmakers raising concerns about athlete safety ahead of the Olympic Games in China. We'll have reaction after the break. Welcome back. Tax season is here, but this year your tax returns might look a little different. Washington correspondent Hannah Brandt explains why.
This year, tax season comes with a warning.
Your refunds are going to be delayed, so just expect that.
That's partly because the IRS is still behind on last year's returns.
The IRS right now has an unacceptable backlog.
Plus, the agency is understaffed and underfunded.
The agency has not been equipped with the resources it needs to adequately serve taxpayers in normal times, let alone during a pandemic.
To avoid extra long delays, the IRS suggests people file early and make sure their returns are accurate and include all of the necessary documents.
The best way that you can overcome, having to wait too long is just to make sure that you file as error-free of a return as you can.
An IRS spokesman, Clay Sanford, says the agency is really encouraging people to file electronically this year.
If you e-file plus direct deposit, the majority of folks can expect refunds in 21 days or less.
Tax expert Mickey Sood with JMU Tax and Financial points out this year you may need to bring in 2 extra tax documents. The IRS is sending out a letter to families who got child tax credit payments and anyone who got the $1,400 stimulus payment.
All the typical documents, but bring those extra 2 documents, because if you don't do that, your refund will be held.
The stimulus money just needs to be reported. It won't impact your return. But families who got the child tax credit will see a smaller return.
You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you got it during the year, expect that amount less at the end of the year when you file your tax return.
In Washington, I'm Hannah Brandt.
With the Winter Olympics a few days away now, Republican lawmakers are putting pressure on China for its human rights abuses. Florida Senator Rick Scott says he fears for the American athletes as they head to China to compete. And more than 24 House lawmakers are calling out the companies who are sponsoring the Beijing Olympics, like Delta and Coca-Cola. Washington correspondent Anna Warnicki has the latest.
I can't tell you how worried I am about the athletes competing in Beijing.
Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott says he fears for the more than 200 American athletes heading to Beijing next week to compete in the 24th Winter Olympic Games.
I've called on the IOC and the Biden administration to take every step necessary to keep Americans safe. But unfortunately, I haven't heard a word from them on what they're doing about it.
The Biden administration says it will not send any diplomatic or official representation to Beijing to protest Chinese human rights abuses.
It's an ongoing genocide as we speak, and a diplomatic boycott is just a joke.
Florida Republican Congressman Mike Waltz says a diplomatic boycott isn't enough.
We're on the verge of sending our athletes and companies to Beijing and flying the American flag, giving the Chinese Communist Party this global propaganda platform.
We must show that the United States is an unyielding and unapologetic advocate for human rights and unafraid of speaking the truth and upsetting General Secretary Xi and his Communist Party thugs.
Lawmakers are also putting pressure on the companies sponsoring the Beijing Olympics. 25 Republicans on the House Energy and Commerce Committee sent letters to Coca-Cola, Airbnb, and Toyota, asking them to publicly recognize that China is committing human rights abuses and use their Olympic platform to highlight these abuses to the rest of the world. In Washington, I'm Anna Warnicki.
Coming up, a new study projects skyrocketing population growth for our state through 2060. How many more people could be moving in after the break?
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
We turn now to Utah's exploding population and a new study that projects even more massive growth to come. For more on that, we turn to Mallory Bateman. She is with the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute up at the University of Utah. Mallory, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Such a fascinating report. Let's first get into the background. Why was it done? For what purpose?
Yeah, so we actually get to revisit these projections every 4 years, and they're long-term planning projections, so we put them out there so that communities can use them to think about their growth. We're a state that's always grown, and so having these 40-year future lens kind of provides some additional insights to thinking about the future.
Yeah, it seems so far away, but we really know it's not really. And when you take a look at the way the state has grown already from just the last 40 years, it's almost mind-boggling to take a look at these projections. So let's get right into them. What does the study show as far as total population by 2060?
So right now we're around 3.3 million residents, and we project we'll add around 2.2 million by 2060. So that puts us around 5.45 million new residents. And Salt Lake and Utah counties are the main drivers of the growth. So we keep that kind of strong Wasatch Front, but Southwest Utah also experiences some significant growth as well.
So what does that mean for the Wasatch Front and the Salt Lake and Utah County valleys?
Continued growth, continued new people, new residents coming into the community. Additionally, it's a lot of our employment. So our kind of economy is centered in these areas, and so that's part of what's driving the growth.
Okay, that makes sense. But obviously, people may have to branch out as far as living and maybe commute to those areas because there's only so much room in a valley, right?
Yeah.
Another interesting thing, if I remember right, Utah County is actually expected to see the most growth. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What did the studies say about that?
We project around 674,000 new residents in Utah County. So putting their 2060 population around 1.3 million residents.
So up to 5.45 million. I mean, you kind of think about how long it takes to get up the mountain now to go skiing and the lines and whatnot. It's kind of hard to comprehend, but we need to plan ahead and make that plan ahead for that, no doubt. You already mentioned the economy and employment, but obviously with that many more people being here, there's going to be new jobs for them as well. Talk about what the report found as far as employment goes.
Yeah, so this is a demographic and economic model. So we looked at the economy and we project an additional 1.3 million jobs statewide out to 2060. And as I mentioned, Salt Lake and Utah County are the primary drivers there, but we see, again, strong growth in that southwest corner of the state, down in Washington County, Iron County, and see a lot of jobs. Construction is actually the industry that we project the most job growth in, so if you have a growing place, it makes sense you're gonna have high construction jobs.
Yeah, no doubt about that. What other sectors did the report show may see an increase?
Almost everything. We look, I think it's over, I think it's around 29 industry segments that are kind of big segments of the economy, but everything sees some significant growth, with the exception of some of the kind of extractive industries like mining, And I think military, actually, we project a small decrease.
You mentioned some of the smaller rural counties also growing. What types of jobs are we expecting to see in those areas?
In those areas, I think we kind of maintain what they have now unless there was some kind of big project change. In some of the counties that have, coal-fired power plants, for example, that we know are planning to close, those make changes in those economies. But we've got some diverse economies throughout our rural counties that have different pictures.
An interesting thing we hear from officials in rural settings all the time is that one of our greatest exports is our children, because there aren't a lot of opportunities in rural areas. Do you see that staying like that, or will there be more opportunities where people can choose to stay in rural Utah if they'd like to?
I think we generally kind of saw similar economic pictures throughout rural Utah. And so, this is, again, another opportunity for decision makers to look at these economic and demographic projections and kind of think about, a different decision now could change what that long-term picture is in the future.
Yeah, remote working, obviously, probably a big part of that conversation. Very interesting insight on how we actually grow, because it's going to be different in the first part of that time frame versus the latter part. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so we're a state that has traditionally relied on natural increase, which is births minus deaths. And that's been a dependable driver of our growth. And we project that starting in the 2040s, that's actually going to flip, and net migration, so more people moving in than moving out, is going to drive our growth. And part of that is due to that strong, growing economy, the economic diversity, and then also some demographic changes like our aging population and declines in fertility.
We talked about some of the challenges that come along with growth. What impact might that have as the time goes on, and could it potentially change these projections?
Yeah, I think one thing with these projections is we want to remind people they are planning projections, and a big change now or even a small change in a certain community could change what the future looks like. We tried to consider everything we know at this point, but that picture changes pretty quick in Utah, where we're growing constantly. So as things grow and change, that's why we get to revisit them every 4 years and hopefully inform the future.
And if I'm not mistaken, you have seen things change from the last 4 years, correct? Talk about the changes there.
Yeah, so some of the things are, that the decreases in fertility that we saw last time around. We have a little bit more data now, and that showed that decline has continued. And so that ended up impacting what our final population projection looked like. It's actually a little bit lower than what we had projected in 2017.
Also looked into life expectancy, which is expected to get higher, is that correct?
Yeah, we projected a continued increase in life expectancy in the state, and that's seen throughout the state. It's seen, kind of differently in different areas. But we do expect that will continue to grow, and we do have, right now we're seeing kind of the baby boomers age up into those older age segments. But the end of this projection period, it's people like me, people younger than me, aging up into that age segment. So if we're lucky, that increased life expectancy will keep us around a little longer.
Gotcha. It's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out. Again, it's just hard to imagine that many more people here in our state, knowing the growth we've gone through. One last question for you. What is your hope? You do this study and the potential impact and what could happen. Where does it go from here?
We really just hope that decision makers across the state, across communities, look at these and consider them in their planning of the future, thinking about big projects they might have coming up or things they want to tackle, hoping these are a factor in their decision-making process. And if you're one of those decision makers and you have something important coming up, let us know. We'd love to have that local information as we move forward into our next round in a couple years.
Yeah. Obviously, planning is key when you take a look at numbers like these. Mallory, great conversation. Thanks so much for being here and helping us understand it more.
Yeah, thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. We are entering the third week of the general legislative session. The Capitol will be quiet on Monday, February 21st. That's for President's Day. And then the final day is Friday, March 4th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.